My name is Cora, and my story is about roots. Not the kind you pull up and sell for a profit, but the kind that anchor you to a place, to a history you didn't even know you were a part of. My family, led by my very ambitious, very practical brother Dean, decided our roots weren't profitable enough. They sold our ancestral farm, a sprawling property that had been in our family for over a century, to a corporate agriculture giant. They called it progress. They called it securing our future. I called it a betrayal. While Dean was popping champagne and talking about investment portfolios, I was left with what he called the scraps, a small 5-acre plot of land he couldn't legally sell because it had been deeded to me directly by our great-grandmother. On that land was an old weathered cabin and a small, useless apiary. He told me, with a patronizing smile, that I can still feel like a physical slap, that I could play with my bees while he went out and invested the real money. He laughed. Our parents laughed with him. What he didn't know, what none of them bothered to remember, was that our great-grandmother, Lara, wasn't just a farmer's wife. She was a quiet pioneer in apee therapy, the medicinal use of bee products, and the useless bees I was left to play with, the ones buzzing over the unique strain of wildflowers that grew only on my little patch of earth, produced a honey so rare, so medically potent, that a single jar of it turned out to be worth more than his entire first-year profit from the sale of our home. This is the story of how my brother sold our family's soul for a quick payout, and how I, with nothing but a few beehives and a forgotten legacy, bought it back. The final family meeting felt less like a discussion and more like a verdict being read. We sat in the formal dining room of the old farmhouse, a room we only used for holidays and funerals. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and the unspoken grief of 100 years of family history about to be erased. My father, a man whose spine seemed to have dissolved over the years, sat at the head of the table, looking at his hands. My mother was next to him, her face a mask of anxious pride, her eyes fixed on her golden boy, my brother, Dean. Dean stood by the stone fireplace, a crisp sales prospectus in his hand, radiating the kind of smug confidence that only a man who has never truly failed can possess. He wasn't just my brother, he was the family's designated success story, the one who'd gone to business school and come back speaking a language of leveraging assets and maximizing returns that felt alien in that old house. He tapped the glossy cover of the prospectus. "Agricorp's offer is more than generous," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "It's a lifeline. This farm," he gestured vaguely toward the window, "has been a financial drain for 2 decades. Grandpa's sentimentality nearly bankrupted us. This deal sets us all up for life." Us all, the words hung in the air, heavy and false. The deal set him up. He had brokered it. He would manage the family trust that the proceeds would be funneled into, and he would be taking a handsome management fee for his troubles. The rest of us, our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, were getting payouts that sounded large, but once divided, were little more than a down payment on a new car. And then there was me. I hadn't said a word. I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, feeling the familiar hot sting of being invisible. I was the quiet one, the one who had stayed. After college, while Dean was climbing the corporate ladder in the city, I had come home. I helped my grandfather with the bookkeeping. I tended the massive gardens my grandmother had loved, and I had taken over the care of the apiary from my great-grandmother Alara. The bees were my solace, the low, constant hum of the hives was the only sound that could quiet the noise in my head. The main parcels, totaling 450 acres, will be transferred to Agricorp at the end of the month, Dean continued, his eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to object. The equipment, the barn, the main house, it's all part of the package. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, shifted nervously, and Cora's piece, the little cottage, and the wildflower fields behind it. Dean waved a dismissive hand. Untouchable, unfortunately. Great-grandma Alara had some funny ideas about property. She deeded that 5-acre plot to Cora's direct line in her will. A weird ironclad little codicil. It's legally separate. Agricorp's surveyors confirmed it. It's not worth anything to them anyway. It's mostly rock and overgrown weeds. He looked at me then, and the smile he gave me was pure condescension. It was the smile he'd been giving me my whole life, the one that said, "Oh, you and your little hobbies. So Cora gets to keep her playhouse," he said, and a few of my cousins tittered nervously. "She can stay here and play with her bees, while the rest of us move into the 21st century. We'll make sure the trust sends you a little stipend, sis, for bee food." The room erupted in forced sycophantic laughter. My mother's was the loudest. It was a physical blow. Bee food, he had reduced my life, my passion, the one thing that connected me to our family's deepest, most meaningful history, to a child's hobby that needed a handout. He didn't see the fields of purple aster and goldenrod, the rare Blue Ridge phlox, that only grew in the strange, shale-rich soil of my little plot. To him they were weeds. He saw a ramshackle cottage. I saw the home where my great-grandmother had raised a family and pioneered her quiet work. He saw insects in a box. I saw a legacy. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the disrespect. It was the casual, brutal way he dismissed my entire existence as worthless. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. It cooled into a quiet, dense resolve that felt heavier and more permanent than the foundation of the house he was so eager to sell. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry or scream. I just met his gaze across the room. And for the first time, I think he saw something in my eyes that wasn't deference. It was a flicker of something else, something cold and ancient. He faltered for a second, his perfect smile tightening at the edges, before he turned back to his audience, dismissing me once more. That was the last time I set foot in the main house. The sale went through. The moving trucks came and went, hauling away a century of memories. Dean threw a lavish party in the city to celebrate his first big win. I received a check in the mail a few weeks later for $5,000, with a note in my mother's looping script. "A little something to help you get settled, dear. We're all so proud of Dean." I didn't cash it. I pinned it to the wall of my little cottage, next to a faded photograph of great-grandma Alara, her face obscured by a beekeeper's veil, her hands gently tending to a frame of honeycomb. It was a reminder. It wasn't about revenge, not yet, but it was about to be. The first few weeks after the sale were a blur of grief and silence. The rumbling of Agricorp's tractors replaced the familiar sounds of the farm. The horizon, once a gentle roll of green pastures, was now scarred with the geometric precision of industrial agriculture. From my small porch, I could see the massive, impersonal silos they were erecting, where our old red barn used to stand. It felt like a violation. My family was gone, scattered to new suburban houses, bought with the proceeds of our amputated heritage. They called, of course. My mother would phone with breathless updates about Dean's new condo, his brilliant investment strategies, the important people he was meeting. Each word was a tiny, sharp jab, a reminder of my perceived failure, my insignificance. Dean says the market is just ripe for tech stocks. She'd chirp, her voice tinny over the line. He's going to double the family's money in a year. Isn't that wonderful? We're all so lucky to have him. Are you doing okay out there, dear? Are the bees behaving? Are the bees behaving? As if they were naughty children and not a complex, ancient society that held the key to the very ecosystem they had just sold out. I'd murmur something non-committal and hang up, my hand trembling with a rage that had no place to go. The silence of my 5 acres would press in on me, a heavy blanket of isolation. I was an island, surrounded by a sea of corporate efficiency. The wild flower fields, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like the walls of a prison. This was my life now, a footnote in my family's grand success story. My low point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. The sky was the color of lead, and a cold, persistent drizzle had turned my path to the apiary into a muddy trench. I'd spent the morning trying to reinforce one of the older hive stands, my fingers numb, my clothes soaked through. I finally gave up and retreated into the cottage, dripping a puddle onto the worn pine floor. The place was tiny, just a main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and a bathroom. But it was filled with Alara's presence. Her books on botany and herbal remedies lined the shelves, their pages soft and yellowed with age. Her old rocking chair was still by the window, the wood worn smooth in the exact places her hands and elbows would have rested. I collapsed into that chair, shivering, and just stared out at the rain-streaked fields. The check from my mother was still pinned to the wall, a pale green rectangle of pity. I felt a wave of despair so profound, it was physical. My throat closed up. Dean was right, I was a failure. I was 32 years old, living in a one-room cabin, with no job, no prospects, and a hobby that everyone laughed at. They were all out there, living their big, important lives, while I was here, alone, with a bunch of bugs and weeds. The weight of their judgment, an accumulation of years of casual dismissals and condescending smiles, finally crushed me. I put my head in my hands, and I wept, not loud, angry sobs, but the silent, hopeless tears of someone who has finally started to believe the lies they've been told about themselves. That could have been the end of the story. I could have withered away out there, a strange little hermit woman with her bees, a local curiosity. But as I sat there, stewing in my own misery, my eyes fell upon a heavy leather-bound trunk, tucked under Alara's old writing desk. I had never opened it, it was locked, and I'd always respected it as her private domain. But in that moment of absolute desolation, I felt a pull, a desperate need to connect with the one person who would have understood, the one person who had seen the value in this place. I found the key on a thin chain, hidden in the back of a drawer full of old seed packets. It was small and ornate, made of brass. With a click, the lock on the trunk sprang open. The air that rose up smelled of dried lavender, old paper, and beeswax. Inside, nestled among pressed flowers and carefully labeled packets of seeds, were her journals, dozens of them, not diaries, but detailed, scientific logs, filled with her elegant spidery script. I spent the rest of that day and all through the night reading. This was my first flashback, not to a memory, but into the mind of my great-grandmother. Her voice, clear and precise, rose from the pages. She wasn't just a beekeeper, she was a botanist, a chemist, a healer. She documented everything. She wrote about the unique geology of this specific plot of land, the high concentration of shale and quartz in the soil that made it unsuitable for traditional crops but perfect for a specific ecosystem of deep-rooted wildflowers. She had crossbred them for decades, selecting for specific properties. There were pages and pages about the bees themselves. She believed they weren't the standard Italian bees common to the area. She thought they were a unique, isolated strain that had adapted to this specific flora over generations. They were hardier, more resilient, and she hypothesized their honey was different. And then I found it, a whole volume, titled Apis Elara mellifera, Observations on the Propolis and Honey of the Blue Ridge Line. My breath caught. She had named them her bees. In the journal, she detailed her experiments. She had used the honey to treat burns on farmhands, to soothe coughs, to dress wounds that refused to heal, but it went deeper. She had a correspondence with a university professor in Germany in the 1930s. She'd sent him samples. He'd done a preliminary analysis. His letters were tucked between the pages, the German script precise and academic. He was astonished. He wrote of unusually high concentrations of certain phenolic compounds, particularly something he called punosembrin, a flavonoid known for its antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. He mentioned its potential neuroprotective effects. He urged her to publish, to share her work with the world. Her last entry in that volume was dated a week before she passed away. The world is not ready for this quiet magic. They want loud miracles and quick pills, but the secret is in the flowers, and the keepers of the secret are the bees. I will leave the land and the keepers in the trust of those with quiet hands and a patient heart. The world will catch up someday. I remembered a specific flashback of my own then, a memory I hadn't understood at the time. I was about 10 years old, and Dean, who was 15, had been dared by his friends to poke a stick into one of the hives. He'd been stung, of course, a nasty one on his cheek that swelled up immediately. He came running to the house, screaming. My mother, panicked, reaching for ice and calling the doctor, but great-grandma Elara had been there. She calmly took me by the hand and led me to the cottage. She took a tiny dab of a dark, rich honey from a special jar she kept on the mantelpiece and applied it to a small bandage. She found Dean, sat him down, and told him to be still. She cleaned the sting and placed the honey poultice over it. The bees give back what is taken, she had whispered. I remembered Dean scoffing, even then, calling it witchcraft, but the next morning, the swelling was almost gone. The pain was a dull ache. My mother credited the doctor's antihistamine cream, but I remembered the honey. Sitting there in the cottage, with Alara's journals spread around me, the rain finally stopping outside, everything clicked into place. The condescending words, "Play with your bees," echoed in my head, but now they sounded different. They sounded foolish, ignorant. He called it playing. I called it a legacy. This wasn't just honey. This wasn't a hobby. This was a medical breakthrough, locked in a honeycomb. The despair that had crippled me just hours before was gone, burned away by a surge of adrenaline and a cold, clear purpose. The world had finally caught up, and I had the quiet hands and the patient heart Elara had been waiting for. My brother hadn't left me with scraps. He had left me the entire fortune, and hadn't been smart enough to see it. It wasn't about revenge, until in that moment it absolutely, unequivocally was. I looked at the $5,000 check on the wall, and for the first time since the sale, I smiled. My plan began to form, not as a vague wish for justice, but as a series of calm, deliberate steps. The first step was to prove it. The journals were my roadmap, but I needed a modern-day confirmation. I knew I couldn't walk into a standard lab and ask them to test some honey. I needed an expert, someone who wouldn't dismiss me, someone who understood the intersection of botany and biochemistry. My great-grandmother's correspondence with the German professor gave me an idea. I spent a week buried in online academic databases, cross-referencing papers on apitherapy, flavonoids, and the unique flora of the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's how I found his name. Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris was a young, slightly beleaguered adjunct professor at the State University, an hour away. His profile said his research focused on novel bioactive compounds in Appalachian plant species. He was perfect. He was also, according to a university newsletter I dug up, desperately trying to secure funding for his He was hungry. He was the ally I needed. Getting a meeting with him was harder than I expected. His email inbox was probably a graveyard of student pleas and administrative notices. I sent 3 polite, professional emails, mentioning my private apiary and a potentially unique honey composition, but got no reply. So I changed tactics. I packed up a small crate. Inside, I placed a sealed, sterilized 1-ounce jar of the dark, viscous honey. Alongside it, I put a laminated, high-quality photograph of the Blue Ridge phlox in full bloom. And on top, I laid a carefully transcribed copy of the 1930s letter from the German professor, highlighting the passage about pinosembrin. I drove to the university, found the biology building, and left the package with the departmental secretary, a kind-faced woman named Brenda, with a simple note: Dr. Thorne, I believe this will be worth your time. Cora Miller. 2 days later, my phone rang. The number was from the university. Is this Cora Miller? The voice was male, cautious, and vibrating with a nervous energy I recognized as academic excitement. This is she. This is Dr. Eris Thorne. Where did you get this honey? I smiled. I have the hives. They're on my property. There was a pause, and I could hear the rustle of papers. Miss Miller, the preliminary readings I'm getting on this sample are they're not possible. The concentration of specific flavonoids is 10 times higher than any recorded sample of Manuka honey. The enzymatic activity is off the charts. This isn't just honey. This is a potent anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial agent. I need to see the hives. I need to see the floral source. Can I come out there? Today? He was everything I'd hoped for. Eris arrived that afternoon in a beat-up station wagon that smelled faintly of soil and ethanol. He was younger than I'd pictured. Maybe early 30s like me, with wire-rimmed glasses that were constantly slipping down his nose and an infectious, unbridled enthusiasm that was the complete opposite of my brother's slick corporate charm. He didn't see a ramshackle cottage. He saw a pristine research environment. He didn't see weeds. He saw a unique symbiotic floral ecosystem that has been preserved from modern contaminants. When I showed him Alara's journals, he treated them with the reverence of sacred texts. He spent an hour just looking at the hives from a distance, muttering to himself about the bees' flight patterns and their unusually calm demeanor. He was a scientist, but he was also a man in love with the natural world. He was the voice of reason I so desperately needed, validating everything I had started to believe. Your great-grandmother wasn't just a beekeeper, Cora, he said, his eyes wide with awe, as he gently touched the cover of one of the journals. She was a brilliant self-taught geneticist and biologist. What she did here, cultivating these specific flowers and preserving this bee lineage, it's the work of a lifetime, several lifetimes. Our partnership was forged that day. We agreed to work together. I had the raw materials and the historical data. He had the scientific expertise and the lab access, however limited. It became our secret project, My quiet life was replaced with a new kind of quiet intensity. Eris would drive out 2 or 3 times a week. We'd collect samples, not just of the honey, but of the pollen, the propolis, the resinous mixture that bees produce, and the flowers themselves. We worked late into the nights in my little cottage, the table covered in petri dishes and printouts, the air smelling of coffee and beeswax. It was during this time that the subplot of my family's ignorance continued to play out in the background, a constant, irritating buzz. My mother called to inform me that Dean had bought a boat, a very large, very expensive boat. He's calling it the Legacy, she said, her voice dripping with pride. In honor of the farm, you know, he's taking all of us out on the lake this weekend. It's a shame you're so far away. The irony was so thick, I could have bottled it. While Dean was christening a fiberglass monument to his own ego, Eris and I were on the verge of a genuine discovery. We had confirmed Alara's hypothesis. The bees were, in fact, a genetically distinct subspecies. Eris, in a fit of poetic justice, had started calling them Apis mellifera, Alare in our notes. The honey's chemical composition was even more remarkable than the initial tests suggested. It contained a unique combination of compounds that not only fought inflammation, but seemed to actively promote cellular regeneration in the lab cultures Eris ran. This could revolutionize wound care. Cora, he told me one night, his voice hushed with disbelief as he stared at a micrograph on his laptop screen. Maybe even help with nerve damage. This isn't just potent. It's intelligent. It's like the compounds work in synergy. We knew we had to protect it. This was our hidden leverage. Eris, using his university connections, found a patent lawyer who specialized in intellectual property for biotech. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright, immediately understood the stakes. We spent weeks compiling the evidence, Alara's journals, as proof of prior art and discovery, Eris's lab data, as scientific validation, and genetic sequencing of both the bees and the key wildflower, the Blue Ridge phlox. We filed for multiple patents. The first was a utility patent on the genetic sequence of the Apis mellifera alare strain. The second was on the specific chemical composition of the honey and propolis they produced. The third, the most crucial, was a method of use patent for its application in treating specific medical conditions, starting with antibiotic-resistant skin infections. Miss Albright was blunt. "This is your fortress," she said, tapping the thick stack of patent applications. "Anyone who wants to use these bees, this honey, or this medical process will have to come through you. You don't just own the goose that lays the golden eggs, you own the biological patent on the gold itself." While the patents were pending, a process that would take months, my Aunt Carol called me. Her voice was different. The usual cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a thread of anxiety. "Cora, honey, I was just talking to your mother," she began, a little too casually. Well, his big AgriCorp deal isn't going as smoothly as he'd hoped." I kept my voice neutral. "What's wrong?" "It's the strangest thing. Their first crop of genetically modified soybeans. The yields are terrible. The pods aren't filling out. The AgriCorp people are furious. They're saying it's a pollination issue. They're blaming the local environment." Dean is getting non-stop, angry phone calls. He promised them a turnkey operation. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked out my window at the riot of purple, yellow, and blue wildflowers, buzzing with the gentle, diligent motion of thousands of my bees. Some roots, I thought, run deeper than property lines. The native pollinators in the region had been decimated over the years by pesticides and habitat loss. The commercial honeybees Agricorp had brought in were inefficient, unused to the local flora. They had bought a massive 450-acre engine but had thrown away the one tiny, irreplaceable key required to start it. My useless field of weeds wasn't just a sanctuary. It was the linchpin of the entire local ecosystem. And my brother, in his infinite wisdom, had handed it to me for free. The panic hadn't reached him yet, but I could hear it, a faint, distant rumbling on the horizon, like the sound of an approaching storm, and I was ready. I was standing in the only shelter for miles. The first move wasn't a dramatic, confrontational reveal. It was silent. It was professional. With the patents pending and our data secure, Eris and I, guided by Miss Albright, formed a small private research company. We called it Elara Biologics in honor of my great-grandmother. Our first and only product was a sterile, medically graded version of the honey, packaged in small, unassuming vials. We didn't market it to the public. We targeted a very specific, very niche clientele. Eris had a contact, a former mentor who now ran a highly specialized burn unit at a prestigious private hospital in Baltimore. He was a man who dealt with the worst kinds of wounds, the ones that resisted all conventional treatment. We sent him a research package, the data, the safety profiles, and a small complimentary supply for compassionate use cases, all under a strict non-disclosure agreement. 2 months passed. I focused on the apiary, expanding the number of hives, carefully cultivating the wildflower fields, and sinking every cent I had into our new little company. Dean and my family seemed to have forgotten I existed, which was a blessing. The occasional condescending phone calls from my mother had trickled to a stop, replaced by an ominous silence. I knew from Aunt Carol that the situation with Agricorp was deteriorating. The corporation had tried a second planting with a different crop, a special variety of canola, and the results were even worse. Their multi-million-dollar investment was turning into a barren wasteland. The corporate behemoth was getting angry, and my brother was the one in their line of fire. The call from the doctor in Baltimore came on a crisp November morning. I was out with the bees, the autumn sun warm on my back, the familiar hum a comforting presence. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw the Maryland area code. I answered, my heart thumping. "Cora, it's Dr. Matthews," the voice on the other end said. It was deep, serious, and held a note of profound astonishment. I don't know what to tell you. We had a patient, a firefighter with third-degree burns, that had developed a severe antibiotic-resistant MRSA infection. We'd tried everything. He was heading for a full amputation. As a last resort, we used your Elara honeys. He paused, and I held my breath. In 48 hours, the infection was gone. Not reduced, gone. The inflammation is down by 90%, and we're seeing new epithelial tissue growth at a rate I have never ever witnessed in my 30-year career. This isn't just a treatment, it's a miracle. We need more. We need as much as you can produce. Name your price. I leaned against a hive, my knees suddenly weak. I looked at Eris, who was standing nearby, and gave him a shaky thumbs up. He broke into a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face. This was it, the validation. The first real taste of victory. We didn't name a price. Miss Albright had advised us on this. Instead, we offered the hospital an exclusive initial supply contract, not for a sale, but for a joint clinical trial. It was a smarter long-term move, one that would cement our medical credibility and make our patents ironclad. The value wasn't in the single jars, it was in the intellectual property and the verifiable results. The hospital eagerly agreed, and their legal team had a multi-million-dollar research and development contract drafted within a week. Alara Biologics was no longer just two people in a cottage. It was a funded clinical-stage biotech company. The antagonist panic started exactly as I had predicted. It began not with a bang, but with a knock on my door. It was a man from AgriCorp, a field agronomist. He was polite, almost deferential. He explained the pollination problem, the crop failures. He had a theory. He'd noticed the intense pollinator activity on my land. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to lease them my hives. "We'd pay you, of course," he said, looking around at my useless plot with new eyes. "A standard pollination services fee, a few $1,000s for the season." I looked him straight in the eye. "My bees are not for lease," I said, my voice calm and firm. "They are part of a private, ongoing research project." He was taken aback. He clearly expected me to be grateful for the offer. He stammered, mentioned his superiors, and left, looking confused. 2 days later, a car I didn't recognize pulled up my long driveway. A sleek black town car. Out stepped a woman in a severe business suit, followed by my brother Dean. He looked terrible. His confident swagger was gone. His face was pale. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his expensive suit looked rumpled, as if he'd been sleeping in it. He couldn't meet my gaze. The woman, however, stared at me with the cold, appraising look of a predator. "Miss Miller," she began, her voice like ice. "I'm Veronica Shaw, Executive Vice President for AgriCorp North America. We have a problem, and we believe you are the solution." Dean shuffled his feet behind her, looking at the ground. "We have a significant pollination deficit," she continued, getting straight to the point. "My agronomists tell me your land contains the only significant population of viable native pollinators in this valley. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer to purchase this 5-acre plot. It would rectify a significant oversight in our initial acquisition." She said, "Oversight," but her eyes said, "My idiot subordinate's catastrophic mistake." I could feel the heat of Dean's humiliation from 10 feet away. "The land is not for sale," I said, just as calmly as before. Veronica Shaw's eyebrow twitched. "Perhaps you misunderstand. We are authorized to offer you, let's say $500,000, a handsome profit for a piece of land that is, forgive me, largely undeveloped." I almost laughed. 500,000. It was a fortune to the woman I had been 6 months ago. Now, compared to the clinical trial contract sitting on my desk, it was pocket change. "I understand perfectly, Miss Shaw," I replied, enjoying the moment. "The land is not for sale. The bees, the flora, and the land itself are all integral components of a patented biomedical research program. They are not available at any price." I let the word patented hang in the air between us. This was a language she understood. Dean finally looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. "Patented? What are you talking about, Cora?" "Patented what? Your bugs?" Before I could answer, Miss Shaw held up a hand, silencing him with a single cutting gesture. She was already connecting the dots. The crop failure, the unique pollinators, the patents. Her expression shifted from annoyance to cold, calculating fury. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at Dean. "Did you know about this?" she asked him, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you know this plot had a pre-existing research value?" "No, of course not," Dean sputtered, panicking. "It's just weeds and bugs. She's making it up. She's playing some kind of game." I just stood there, silent, letting his panic fill the space. He had called it playing. Now the words sounded desperate, pathetic. Miss Shaw turned her back on him completely. A gesture of ultimate corporate dismissal. She looked at me one last time. "My legal team will be in touch with your legal team, Miss Miller," she said. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, a concession. She got back in her car without another word. The town car crunched back down the gravel driveway, leaving Dean standing there alone, dust settling around his expensive shoes. He looked utterly lost. The golden boy had finally tarnished, and the real takeover had just begun. The departure of Veronica Shaw's town car marked the beginning of the great unraveling. Dean was left standing in my driveway like a piece of forgotten luggage, his face a jumble of confusion, anger, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear. "What was that, Cora?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Patents, research, what lies have you been feeding them?" "The truth, Dean," I said, my voice devoid of the anger I thought I'd feel. All I felt was a strange, weary pity, something you wouldn't recognize. This land, these bees, they're not worthless. They never were. You were just too arrogant to see it. Worthless? I got us millions. He shot back, his old bravado, making a weak attempt at a comeback. You sold the engine, and threw away the key. Dean, AgriCorp doesn't care about your portfolio. They care about their dying crops. Their multi-million-dollar investment is failing because of what's on this useless patch of land you so generously let me keep. The blood drained from his face as the reality of his situation finally sank in. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed a cardinal sin in his world. He had failed to do his due diligence. He had cost his powerful new partners millions, and made himself look like a fool. "You did this on purpose," he whispered, the accusation weak. "You set me up." "No, Dean," I said, turning to walk back to my cottage. "You set yourself up. You've been doing it for years. I just decided to stop breaking your fall." That was the last time he tried to speak to me with any semblance of authority. The power shift wasn't just between me and him. It rippled through the entire family. The news of AgriCorp's disaster and my patented bees spread like wildfire. The agent of this news was, predictably, Aunt Carol. She had been getting frantic calls from my mother, who had been getting hysterical calls from Dean. Carol, who had always harbored a soft spot for me, and a deep love for great-grandma Alara, saw the poetic justice immediately. Her call to me was the first signal of the family exodus. "Cora, honey, it's me," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I just heard the most incredible story from your mother. Is it true? About the bees? About Alara's honey?" I told her everything, about the journals, about Eris, about the patents and the clinical trial. She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Oh, Alara, that brilliant, stubborn woman," she said softly. "She always said there was magic in that little field. We all thought she was just being sentimental. Your grandfather, he tried to keep it going, but after she was gone, he just didn't have the heart. And Dean, he has no heart to begin with." She paused. "Cora, I am so sorry. I went along with him. The money, it seemed so easy, but it felt wrong then, and it feels like a crime now. What he did to you, to Alara's memory, it's unforgivable." That was the crack in the dam. Aunt Carol became my advocate within the family. She started talking to the other cousins, the ones who had taken their small payouts, and felt a similar nagging guilt. She reminded them of Alara's kindness, of the way Dean had bulldozed everyone, to the condescending way he'd treated me my entire life. She framed it not as a business deal gone wrong, but as a moral failing. The family, which had been so united behind their golden boy, began to fracture. They saw that Dean hadn't secured their future. He had sold their true inheritance for pennies on the dollar, and kept the lion's share for himself. The respect he had commanded, which was always based on his perceived financial genius, evaporated overnight. The desperate counter-manipulation from my parents was next. It was almost pathetic. My mother called, her voice wavering between tears and fury. "Cora, "What are you doing?" she cried. "You're ruining your brother. Agricorp is threatening to sue him for misrepresentation. They could take everything. He could lose his condo, his boat. After all he's done for this family. All he's done for this family." The phrase was so ingrained in her. I don't think she even realized how absurd it sounded now. What Dean did, he did to himself. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, "he made a bad deal. That's the language he understands, isn't it? The deal just turned out to be bad for him, for once. But you can fix this. You have to talk to them. Tell them to give him a break. He's your brother. Family is supposed to help each other, like he helped me," I asked quietly. "When he called my life's work playing, when he laughed at me in front of everyone, when he left me with what he thought were worthless scraps, that kind of help?" She had no answer for that. The call ended with her sobbing that I was selfish and ungrateful, that I was tearing the family apart. The old guilt trips, the familiar manipulations, they just bounced off me now. I had built a fortress, not just of patents, but of self-respect. Her words couldn't find a way in. My father tried a different tactic. He left a voicemail, his voice heavy with disappointed authority. "Cora, your mother is distraught. This vendetta against your brother has to stop. You've made your point. Now it's time to be the bigger person. Do what's right for the family." It wasn't about revenge until it was, but it had become about so much more than that. It was about legacy. It was about honoring Elara. It was about building something real and meaningful from the ashes of the life they had tried to burn down. Doing what's right for the family had always been code for sacrificing yourself for Dean's benefit. The code was broken. I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. The final, most desperate move came from Dean himself. He showed up at my gate one evening, unannounced. He wasn't the slick executive or the angry, humiliated man I'd seen last. He was a shell. He looked haggard, defeated. "Cora, please," he said, his voice raspy. He couldn't even look at me, staring at the gravel by his feet. "You have to help me. They're going to ruin me. I'll lose everything." He looked up then, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "I'll give you half of my profits from the sale. Just call them off. Make a deal for the pollination, please." It was the ultimate test. The money he was offering was a fortune, more than I could have imagined a year ago. But I looked at his face, at this man who had built his entire identity on the idea of being a winner, now utterly broken, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of clarity. It was never about the money. "It's too late for that, Dean," I said. "This is bigger than you and me now. Elara Biologics has a board. We have research partners, we have a clinical trial. I can't just call them off. And even if I could, I wouldn't." I paused, letting the finality of it sink in. "You need to leave. You're trespassing on private research property." He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The concept that I would turn down that much money, that something else could be more important, was simply not in his programming. He finally turned and walked away, not with anger, but with the shambling gait of a man who had just realized the world didn't work the way he thought it did. The power shift was complete. I wasn't the family scapegoat anymore. I was the one holding all the cards. The final confrontation wasn't a shouting match in a living room. It was a sterile, cold-blooded affair in a glass-walled conference room at Agricorp's regional headquarters. It was a meeting I didn't ask for, but one Miss Albright, my lawyer, had insisted we attend. "Let them see what they're dealing with," she'd said. "Let them see you." So I went. Eris was by my side, looking uncharacteristically neat in a borrowed blazer. His usual academic excitement replaced with a steely resolve. Miss Albright was with us. a shark in her natural habitat. We were Team Elara. On the other side of the massive mahogany table sat Veronica Shaw and two of AgriCorp's in-house lawyers, and at the very end of the table, isolated and looking small, in his expensive suit, was my brother Dean. He was there, I realized, not as a participant, but as an exhibit, Exhibit A, the man who screwed up. My parents were there too, sitting slightly behind him, looking bewildered and out of place. They had been summoned, I suspect by Veronica, to witness the full extent of their son's failure, to apply maximum psychological pressure. Veronica Shaw began, her voice crisp and devoid of any warmth. "Thank you for coming, Miss Miller. Dr. Thorne, let's dispense with the pleasantries. We have a multi-$100 million agricultural investment in this valley that is currently operating at a catastrophic loss due to a pollination deficit. You, Miss Miller, control the only viable solution." She slid a file across the table. "Our legal team has reviewed your patent applications. They are formidable. Congratulations to your great-grandmother's foresight." It was meant as a compliment, but it landed like a shard of glass. "We are here to discuss a partnership," she continued. "AgriCorp is prepared to acquire Elara Biologics for the sum of $25 million. That includes the land, the patents, all research data, and a 5-year consulting contract for you and Dr. Thorne." My mother gasped. My father's eyes went wide. I could see Dean doing the math in his head, his expression a sickening mix of awe and self-loathing. 25 million. It was a staggering number. It was a number designed to end the conversation. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before I spoke. I looked past Veronica, past the lawyers, and directly at my brother. "The company is not for sale," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the room. Veronica's practiced smile didn't waver. "Miss Miller, perhaps you think you can hold out for more. Let me be clear. This is a very strong one-time offer. We have other options. We can invest in drone pollination technology. We can develop our own." "You can't," Eris interrupted, speaking for the first time. His voice was firm. "You can't replicate the specific terroir of that 5-acre plot. You can't synthesize the unique flavonoid compounds in the Blue Ridge phlox. And you certainly can't reverse engineer 100 years of coevolution between a plant and its primary pollinator. Your drones won't work on these specific blossoms. And even if they did, the resulting crops wouldn't carry the secondary resilience traits that come from this specific pollen. We have the data. You have dying fields." The AgriCorp lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Eris had just dismantled their entire negotiating position with a few calm factual sentences. Now it was my turn. I pushed the file back across the table. "As I said, Elara Biologics is not for sale. However, we are willing to offer AgriCorp a limited non-exclusive pollination services contract." Miss Albright slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "These are our terms." Veronica picked it up. Her eyes scanned the page, and for the first time her composure cracked. A flicker of disbelief, then fury crossed her face. "This is outrageous," one of her lawyers sputtered. I knew what was on the paper. We weren't asking for a flat fee. We were asking for a percentage of the gross market value of the crops pollinated by our bees, a number that would ultimately be worth far more than their $25 million offer. The contract also stipulated that AgriCorp had to publicly fund a new research wing at the state university, dedicated to sustainable agriculture and native pollinator preservation, to be named the Elara Miller Center for Ecological Studies, and the final clause was the one I had insisted on. It stipulated that AgriCorp would issue a formal press release, acknowledging that the success of their venture was entirely dependent on the legacy of a woman their own acquisition report had dismissed, and that the initial land deal, brokered by Dean Miller, was based on a fundamental and costly underevaluation of key ecological assets. It was a public execution of my brother's career and reputation. You are demanding a share of our profits and a public admission of our failure, Veronica said, her voice dangerously low. I am offering you a way to save your investment, I corrected her, and a chance to publicly correct the record. My great-grandmother's work was erased. I'm putting it back in the history books. These are the terms. They are non-negotiable. I stood up. Eris and Miss Albright stood with me. You have 24 hours to decide. As we turned to leave, my mother finally found her voice. Cora, you can't do this to him. To your own brother. I stopped at the door and looked back at my family. At my weeping mother, my stone-faced father, and my brother was staring at the table. A completely broken man. He had built his world on numbers, on profit and loss, and he had just been rendered a rounding error in the story of my success. I didn't do this to him, I said, my gaze sweeping over all of them, the people who had stood by and watched, who had laughed at me. You all did. You sold our home, you sold our history, and you celebrated. You just sold it to the wrong person. The new reality began to set in the moment we walked out of that conference room. Agricorp, backed into a corner with their shareholders breathing down their necks, accepted our terms within 12 hours. The press release went out the next day. It was a masterpiece of corporate jargon, but the message was clear. Dean Miller had made a colossal error, and the useless little plot of land he discarded was now the single most valuable asset in the entire valley. My life transformed. The quiet hum of the bees was now punctuated by the hum of activity. The Alara Miller Center for Ecological Studies became a reality, with Eris at its helm, finally given the funding and resources he deserved. Ilara Biologics grew, but we kept it deliberate and focused. We partnered with medical institutions, funded more research, and ensured the honey, which the media had dubbed Ilara's gold, was used where it could do the most good, not just sold to the highest bidder as a luxury commodity. I bought back 100 acres of the original farm from a chastened Agricorp, not for farming, but to rewild it, to create a massive sanctuary for the native flora and pollinators, ensuring Ilara's legacy would be protected forever. I never became the corporate shark Veronica Shaw was. I didn't want to be. I was still the woman who loved the quiet hum of the bees, who found solace in the fields of wild flowers. But now that quiet was a position of strength, not a symptom of invisibility. The fallout for my family was swift and devastating. Dean was of course fired from his position as manager of the family trust. Agricorp's public humiliation of him made him a pariah in the business world he so desperately wanted to conquer. He had to sell his boat, the legacy, and his new condo to cover the legal fees from the family members who sued him for mismanaging the trust. The last I heard from Aunt Carol was that he was living in a small apartment and working a low-level sales job, the swagger completely gone. My parents tried to bridge the gap, but the chasm was too wide. They couldn't understand my choices, why I didn't just take the money and forgive and forget. They couldn't see that what had been broken wasn't a bank account, it was trust, it was respect. Our relationship exists now only in the form of stilted holiday cards. We are strangers bound by blood, nothing more. Aunt Carol, and a few of the other cousins, however, became a new kind of family. They visit the sanctuary. They help with the wildflower planting. They tell their children stories about great-grandma Alara, not as a sentimental old woman, but as the brilliant scientist she was. The roots of our family, the ones I thought had been torn up and sold, are slowly growing back, but in a different, healthier soil. Sometimes I sit in Alara's rocking chair in the cottage, which is now the heart of a much larger, beautiful home I built around it, And I look at the old photograph of her in her beekeeper's veil. It wasn't about revenge, I tell her in my thoughts. But it became about justice. It became about ensuring that value is never again measured solely in dollars and cents. It's measured in heritage, in wisdom, in the quiet, persistent magic of the natural world that people like my brother are too loud to hear. So that's my story. It's a reminder that the things people dismiss as small, as hobbies, or useless can often hold the most profound power. Your worth isn't determined by the people who overlook you. It's determined by you. It's in the passion you cultivate, the knowledge you preserve, and the quiet strength you build when no one is watching. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for loving something they don't understand. Your useless little apiary might just hold the secret to the entire farm. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you've ever felt overlooked or had your passions dismissed, I'd love to read your story in the comments below. It's important we share these experiences to remind each other that we're not alone. And if you enjoyed this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories about justice, vindication, and the surprising ways the world finds its balance. It truly helps more than you know. Take care, and remember to value your own unique patch of wildflowers.